My name is Ruth Callahan, and the first thing I want you to know is that I did not give up my son. I need to say that before anything else, because everything that follows depends on you understanding that one fact completely. I did not walk away. I did not choose another life over him. I did not decide, at any point, that my son was something I could leave behind and move past and build a future without. I was 22 years old and I was alone, and I was up against something I did not yet have the experience or the resources or the knowledge to fight. And I lost. Temporarily, as it turned out. But for 15 years it did not feel temporary. For 15 years it felt like the permanent and unalterable shape of my life. His name is Noah. He is 20 years old now. He has his father's height and my eyes, which are green and slightly too serious for casual conversation. The kind of eyes that make people feel examined even when you are simply listening. He studies civil engineering at a university in Leeds. He makes very good coffee, which he discovered at 17, and has been taking seriously ever since. He sends me voice messages instead of texts, because he says texts lose the tone of things and tone matters. He is right about that. For the first 15 years of his life, he believed I was dead, not absent, not gone, not a mother who had left or chosen not to stay. Dead. He was told by the people who raised him that I had died in a car accident when he was 6 months old, that I had loved him, that it had been sudden, that there was nothing anyone could have done. A complete and detailed and entirely fabricated story, given to a child young enough that by the time he was old enough to question it, it had become simply the shape of his world. The fact of it, the thing that had always been true. His mother was dead. He grew up with that. I want you to understand what that means. Not for me, though it means something enormous for me, and I will tell you what. For him. A child grows up knowing that the first woman who ever loved him is gone. That she exists only in a photograph on a shelf, only in the occasional careful sentences adults offer when he asks. That the loss he carries is permanent and complete and sealed. That there is no door to knock on, no phone to call, no possibility of reunion or explanation, or the chance to simply sit across a table from the person who made him, and ask the questions that children always have. He carried that for 15 years. And then, on a Thursday evening in November, when Noah was 20 years old and sitting in his university flat in Leeds, with a cup of the very good coffee he takes seriously, he found me. Not through a dramatic discovery, not through a document uncovered in an attic, or a deathbed confession, or a stranger arriving at his door with information that changed everything. Through a genealogy website, the kind that millions of ordinary people use every year to trace their family trees, upload photographs, connect with distant relatives, make the past legible. He had uploaded a photograph of himself as part of a family tree project. I had uploaded a photograph of him, the only one I had, taken the day before I lost him, when he was 6 months old and asleep in a pale yellow blanket and entirely unaware that anything in his world was about to change. The website's matching algorithm found us within 48 hours. He sent me a message at 11:17 on a Thursday evening. It said, "I think you might be my mother. I was told you were dead." I read that message 47 times before I was able to reply. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back. Let me take you back 20 years to the beginning. To the year Noah was born, and the year I was 22, and the year I encountered, for the first time in my life, what a family with enough money, and enough determination, and enough complete absence of conscience, is capable of doing to a young woman who has nothing but love and no idea how to fight. Noah's father was a man named Elliot Voss. I want to be precise about how I describe him, because precision matters here, and because the temptation, when telling a story like this, is to make the villain into a monster from the beginning. to describe him in terms that explain, retroactively, how everything that followed was inevitable, how you should have known, how the signs were there. The signs were not obvious. That is the honest truth. Elliot Voss was 26 when I met him, 4 years older than me, and he was charming in the specific way that people are charming when they have grown up being told that charm is a sufficient substitute for character. He was tall and well-dressed and attentive in the early months in a way that felt like being chosen, like being seen. I was 20 years old and working as a receptionist at a dental practice in Harrogate, and I had grown up in a council house in Bradford with a mother who worked nights and a father I had not seen since I was 11. And the feeling of being chosen by someone like Elliot Voss was not something I had the experience yet to examine carefully. I should have examined it carefully. His family was the thing I understood last and should have understood first. The Voss family had been in Harrogate for 3 generations. Property, originally. Then investment. Then the particular kind of wealth that has been in one place long enough that it stops feeling like money and starts feeling like atmosphere, like the natural condition of things, like the air in certain rooms that is simply different from the air outside. And you breathe it without noticing, until you are back outside, and realize how thin the regular air feels by comparison. Gerald Voss, Elliot's father, was 60 at the time. He ran the family investment company from an office on Parliament Street, and sat on 2 charitable boards and was on first-name terms with the kind of people whose first names you recognized from newspapers. He had opinions about everything and expressed them in the tone of a man who had never once been seriously contradicted, and did not expect to begin now. Margaret Voss, Elliot's mother, was 57. She was the kind of woman who is described as formidable by people who mean it as a compliment and terrifying by people who have been on the wrong side of her. She had raised Elliot and his older sister Frances with the complete conviction that the Voss family had standards and that those standards were not negotiable, and that the people Elliot and Frances brought into the family would be measured against those standards from the moment they arrived and would either meet them or would not last. I did not meet them. I knew this from the first dinner, not because Margaret said anything directly unkind. She was too refined for that. But there was a quality to her attention that was like being assessed rather than welcomed, a way of asking questions that was really a way of establishing facts. And the facts she was establishing about me, a 20-year-old receptionist from Bradford, with no degree and no family connections, and a council house background she could identify from 3 sentences of conversation, were clearly not adding up to anything she considered acceptable. Elliot did not defend me. Not at that first dinner, and not at any dinner after it. He had a way of being physically present and emotionally unavailable simultaneously that I did not have a name for at 20, but would understand much better at 35. He was there. He simply never quite took my side. But I loved him, genuinely and without sufficient caution. And when I discovered I was pregnant at 21, I told him with a hope I had not fully examined, and a certainty I had not earned, that this would be the thing that changed the temperature of everything, that a child would make us real in a way we had not quite managed to be on our own. Instead, it made the Voss family very clear about something they had apparently been thinking about for some time. I was not suitable, and my child was a Voss, and in the world as Gerald and Margaret Voss understood it, those 2 facts were a problem with only one acceptable solution. The pressure began before Noah was born. Not loudly, not with threats or ultimatums or anything that could be pointed to later as evidence of what it was. It began the way the Voss family did everything, quietly, through suggestion and implication, and the careful arrangement of circumstances that made certain outcomes feel inevitable without anyone having to say directly that they had been arranged. Margaret came to see me at my flat in Harrogate when I was 5 months pregnant. She brought flowers, which I noticed because she had never brought me anything before, and she sat in my small sitting room with the particular posture of a woman who considers herself to be slumming, and asked me, in a tone of genuine concern, whether I had thought seriously about my future. I told her I had. She told me she was glad, because she had been thinking about it too. And she wanted to be honest with me, woman to woman, because she respected me, she said, and respect required honesty. The honesty was this: I was 21 years old with no degree and a receptionist's salary and a council flat in Harrogate. Elliot, whatever his feelings, was not in a position to marry me. The family would not support that. That was simply the reality, and pretending otherwise would not serve anyone, least of all the child. What the family could offer, what Gerald and Margaret were prepared to do, was ensure that the child, their grandchild, had every advantage. The schools, the opportunities, the financial security, the life that a Voss child deserved. All of that was available. All of that was waiting. But only, she said, if the child was raised as a Voss. I looked at her across my small sitting room with her expensive flowers on my cheap table, and I understood what she was saying, and I told her, as clearly as I could at 5 months pregnant and 21 years old, that I was going to raise my own child. She nodded. She said she understood. She said she hoped I would think about it further. She picked up her bag and she left, and she took the flowers with her, which I only noticed after she had gone, and which told me more about the visit than anything she had said during it. The pressure after that came through Elliot. He did not argue, he presented. Options, he called them. Possibilities. He would lay them out in the reasonable, careful tone he used for everything, and I would sit across from him and feel the walls of my life getting smaller, and I would tell him no, and he would nod and say he understood, and 2 weeks later, there would be another conversation with another set of options slightly reframed. I held my ground for 4 months after Noah was born. 4 months of doing it entirely alone, because Elliot's presence in our lives had become so intermittent and so managed that it barely counted as presence at all. 4 months of night feeds and no sleep, and a salary that did not cover the childcare I needed to keep my job and a family, meaning my own mother, who helped when she could and could not always. 4 months of loving Noah with a completeness that made everything else feel secondary and irrelevant. The flat and the exhaustion and the financial anxiety, and the Voss family circling at the edges of everything. And then something happened that I did not see coming. I got sick. Not seriously, as it turned out. A chest infection that became severe, because I had not been sleeping, and had not been eating properly, and had no one to tell me to rest, because there was no one available to hold Noah while I did. I ended up in hospital for 4 days. My mother took Noah, and while I was in that hospital bed, running a fever and barely able to sit up, someone from the Voss family contacted social services with a concern. An anonymous concern. About the welfare of a 6-month-old child. About his mother's ability to cope. I did not find out until I was discharged. I did not find out who had made the call for another 3 years. But I found out what it had set in motion soon enough. The knock on my door came 8 days after I left hospital. And everything changed. The social worker's name was Linda Marsh. She was in her 40s, practical and professional, with a folder and a pen, and the particular expression of someone who has seen enough difficult situations that they have learned to withhold judgment until they have all the information. She was not unkind. I want to be clear about that, because what happened was not her fault. And it was not the fault of the system in the straightforward way that it is easy to blame systems when they fail you. It was the fault of people who used the system deliberately and skillfully to achieve an outcome they had decided on before Linda Marsh ever knocked on my door. She told me there had been a concern raised about Noah's welfare. She told me she needed to assess the situation. She came into my flat and she looked around, and she noted things in her folder. And she asked me questions. about my support network and my financial situation, and my health and my ability to manage. I answered honestly. That was my first mistake. Though I did not know it then, and am not certain I would have done differently even if I had. I told her about the chest infection. I told her about the hospital stay. I told her that my mother helped when she could, and that Elliot was not consistently present. I told her I was managing. I believed I was managing. I was 22 years old and I was doing everything alone, and I was exhausted in a way that had become so constant, it felt like my natural state. And I sat across from Linda Marsh and I told her I was fine because I genuinely believed that fine was what I was. She visited twice more over the following 3 weeks. On the third visit she told me that given the concerns raised and what she had observed, she was recommending that a family support plan be put in place. This was standard language. It did not sound alarming. It sounded like help. I agreed to it because I needed help, and because I did not yet understand that agreeing to it was the beginning of a process that had an endpoint I had not been shown. 2 weeks later, Elliot came to my flat with a solicitor. Not a solicitor I had met. A solicitor from a firm in Leeds that I later discovered had represented the Voss family for 20 years. He was pleasant and well-dressed, and he explained, in careful, measured language, that given the concerns that had been raised and the support plan that had been put in place, and the ongoing questions about my capacity to provide adequate care, the Voss family was applying for a residency order for Noah. A residency order. I stared at the solicitor, then at Elliot. Elliot was looking at the floor. This is temporary, the solicitor said. Simply a measure to ensure Noah's stability while things are assessed properly. You would have full contact rights, regular visits. Nothing is being taken from you permanently. I asked Elliot to tell me this was not happening. He looked up from the floor, and in his face, I saw something I had not seen before. Not cruelty, not triumph. Something worse than both of those things. Relief. He looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy and had just been permitted to put it down. Like the decision had been made for him by people more capable of making it. And he was grateful, genuinely and shamefully grateful, that he had not had to make it himself. I want you to know, he said, that this is the best thing for Noah. I told him to get out of my flat. They left. I sat on the floor of my sitting room with Noah on my lap and I held him. And I did not cry yet, because crying required a kind of surrender I was not ready to make. I just sat there and held my son and thought about what I had, and what I was up against, and how enormous the distance was between those two things. What I had was love and a determination that felt, in that moment, like the only unassailable thing in my life. What I was up against was a family with 20 years of legal representation, an anonymous social services referral, and a plan that had been in motion since before Noah was born. I did not know yet how that distance would end. But I knew, sitting on that floor with my son in my arms, that I was going to fight every single step of the way. The fight lasted 8 months. I want to tell you it was a fair fight. I want to tell you that the legal system looked at a young mother who loved her son, and a wealthy family who wanted to take him and made the right decision. I want to tell you that love was enough. That determination was enough. That showing up to every hearing and every assessment and every meeting with my folder and my notes and my absolute refusal to concede was enough. It was not enough. Not because I was a bad mother. Every assessment said I was not a bad mother. Linda Marsh herself wrote in her final report that she had no concerns about the quality of care I provided for Noah, and that the attachment between mother and child was strong and healthy, and evident in every visit she had conducted. But the Voss family had a solicitor who had been doing this for 20 years, and I had a legal aid solicitor who was handling 14 other cases simultaneously, and who was competent and genuinely trying and completely outgunned. They had a family home with a garden and a nursery already furnished, and a network of character references from people whose names the judge recognized. I had a council flat and a chest infection on my medical record, and a support network that consisted of my mother who worked nights, and my friend Sarah, who did what she could. They had time. The hearings stretched over months, and each delay cost me more than it cost them, because I was living inside the uncertainty, and they were simply managing it from a distance. And they had something else. Something I did not understand until the fourth hearing, when their solicitor produced a document I had not seen before. A letter, signed by Elliot, stating that he had serious ongoing concerns about my mental and emotional stability, and my ability to provide consistent care for Noah. I looked at Elliot across the courtroom when his solicitor read that letter. He did not look back. That was the moment I understood that the man I had loved and the father of my son had made a complete and final choice between his family and his child's mother. And he had made it without telling me, without warning, without the basic decency of a conversation. He had simply signed his name. The residency order was granted on a Tuesday in March. Noah was 14 months old. The order stated that he would reside primarily with his paternal grandparents, Gerald and Margaret Voss, with contact arrangements for me to be agreed and formalized in a subsequent hearing. The contact arrangements hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks later. I never got to that hearing. 3 weeks after the residency order was granted, I received a letter from the Voss family solicitor informing me that Gerald and Margaret Voss intended to apply for a full adoption order, and that given the residency order already in place, and the documented concerns about my capacity, they had been advised their application had strong prospects. Adoption, not contact arrangements. Not a temporary measure while things stabilized. Adoption, the legal and permanent severing of the relationship between me and my son. I sat with that letter for a long time. Then I called every legal aid solicitor in Harrogate. 3 of them told me the prospects of successfully contesting an adoption application, given the existing residency order, were poor. One of them told me that if I wanted to fight it, I would need private legal representation, which would cost money I did not have. The last one, a woman named Patricia Cole, who worked from a small office above a sandwich shop on James Street, sat across from me and was honest in a way that none of the others had been. She said, "Ruth, I will help you as much as I can with what I have. But I need you to understand what you are facing. These people have resources, and they have a plan, and they have been executing it for over a year. That does not mean you cannot fight. It means you need to know what fighting is going to cost you, and you need to decide if you can pay that price." I asked her what the price was. She looked at me with the steady eyes of a woman who had delivered difficult news enough times to know how to hold the person receiving it. "Everything you have," she said, "and possibly still losing." I looked at her across the small desk above the sandwich shop, with the smell of fresh bread coming up through the floor, and my folder on my lap, and Noah's photograph in the front pocket where I could see it without opening anything. I said, "Tell me where to start." Patricia Cole was the best person I met during those 8 months, and also the bearer of the worst news I received during them. She worked with what she had. She filed objections to the adoption application. She requested full disclosure of all documentation the Voss family had submitted in support of the residency order, including the anonymous social services referral, which we both suspected had a Voss connection, but which we could not prove because anonymous referrals are anonymous by design, and the system that protects vulnerable children from genuine harm also, in this instance, protected the people who had weaponized it. She arranged for an independent assessment of my parenting capacity, which concluded, as Linda Marsh's assessment had concluded, that I was a capable and loving mother with a strong attachment to my son, and no indicators of risk. She gathered character references. My mother, my employer at the dental practice, who wrote a letter describing me as reliable and hardworking and entirely professional. Sarah, my closest friend, who wrote about the kind of mother I was in the specific and genuine language of someone who had been present for the ordinary daily reality of it. She built the best case she could with what we had. It was not enough. The adoption hearing was in November. Noah was 18 months old. I had not seen him in 6 weeks, because the contact arrangements that were supposed to be formalized had been delayed by procedural complications that Patricia described as deliberate obstruction, and that the Voss family's solicitor described as administrative necessity. I sat in that courtroom and I listened to their solicitor present a case that had been constructed over more than a year. Every piece of it placed carefully. The chest infection, the hospital stay, the social services involvement, Elliot's letter, the residency order. Each element presented not as the thing it actually was, but as evidence of a pattern, a consistent and documented pattern of instability and inadequate care that made adoption not a punishment but a protection. A protection. They used that word for what they were doing to me. Patricia presented our case, the independent assessment, the character references, the documented strength of my attachment to Noah, the absence of any genuine safeguarding concern in any professional report. She was precise and she was thorough, and she was working with everything she had. The judge deliberated for 2 days. On the 3rd day I sat in Patricia's small office above the sandwich shop, and she read me the judgment over the phone, because I could not be in the courtroom for the reading, and she did not want me to be alone when I heard it. The adoption order was granted. I sat in that office with the phone in my hand and I listened to Patricia explain what it meant, and what options remained, and what the timelines were, and I heard her words from somewhere that felt very far away, as if the distance between me and everything around me had suddenly become enormous and I was not sure how to cross it. Noah was no longer legally my son. He was a Voss, and somewhere in the terms of the adoption, in the arrangements and the conditions and the legal framework that now governed his life, something had been decided about me that Patricia explained carefully, and that I understood only slowly, and that I want to tell you about now, because it is the thing that took me 15 years to discover. They had told the court that contact with me would be harmful to Noah's stability and development. They had argued successfully that a clean break was in his best interests. No contact arrangement, no photographs sent, no birthday cards, no thread of connection that could be followed back to me. And somewhere in the execution of that clean break, in the story told to a child young enough that by the time he was old enough to question it, the story had become simply the shape of his world. They had added something that had not been part of any court order. They had told him I was dead. That part was their own addition. That part was entirely theirs. The 15 years between losing Noah and finding him again are not a story. I can tell you in the way I have told you everything else. Not because nothing happened. Things happened. Life happened, the way life insists on happening regardless of whether you are ready for it or feel entitled to it. I moved from Harrogate to Manchester 2 years after the adoption. I went back to education at 25, part-time, evenings and weekends, while working as an administrator at a law firm, which was either ironic or appropriate depending on how you looked at it. I qualified as a paralegal at 28. I made friends. I had relationships, 2 of them serious enough to matter, and neither of them quite right in ways I understood only in retrospect. I built a life, a genuine one, not a performance of a life while I waited for something else, but an actual constructed daily existence with work I found meaningful, and people I loved, and a flat in Didsbury with a small balcony, where I grew tomatoes every summer with a dedication that my friend Rachel described as aggressive. But underneath all of it, always, there was Noah. Not as an open wound, That is not quite right. More like a room in a house that you pass every day and do not enter but are always aware of. The door is there. You know what is behind it. You have made a kind of peace with not opening it. But you never forget it is there. I thought about him on his birthdays. Every year on the 14th of October I allowed myself a full day of it. Not the managed background awareness of the other 364 days, but the full weight of it, undefended. I thought about what he would look like, what he would be like, whether he had my eyes, whether he knew, in whatever way children know things that have not been told to them directly, that somewhere in the world there was a person who had not stopped. I kept the photograph, the one I had taken the day before I lost him, 6 months old in a pale yellow blanket, asleep and entirely unaware. I kept it in my wallet for the first 5 years and then in a frame on the bookshelf after that, because I decided he deserved to be seen rather than folded. I did not try to find him. I want to be honest about that, and I want to explain it because I think it is easy, from the outside, to wonder why a mother who loved her son the way I loved mine did not spend 15 years trying to locate him. The adoption order was legal and complete. Any attempt to make contact with Noah without his knowledge or consent, or the involvement of an official intermediary, would have been a violation of that order. I was not willing to do anything that could harm him or frighten him or arrive in his life as something disruptive and unwanted before he was old enough and ready enough to receive it. I also could not bear, if I am completely honest, the possibility of being rejected. So I waited, and I built my life, and I grew my tomatoes. And I kept his photograph on the bookshelf where I could see it every morning. And then, in the August of the year Noah turned 20, my friend Rachel, who was deeply committed to her own family history, and had been trying to convince me for 3 years to join the genealogy website she used, sent me a link with a message that said, "Ruth, just do it. You have nothing to lose. It costs nothing, and you might find something." I sat with that link for 2 weeks. Then on a Sunday afternoon in September I created a profile. I uploaded the photograph of Noah, the only one I had. I added what information I could. His birth date, his birth location, my own details. The bare factual bones of a connection I had been carrying for 15 years, and had never been able to put anywhere official. I did not expect anything. I had spent 15 years managing my expectations about Noah down to a level that made daily life possible. 6 weeks later, the algorithm found us, and 48 hours after that, at 11:17 on a Thursday evening, my phone showed a message from an account I did not recognize. "I think you might be my mother. I was told you were dead." I read that message 47 times. I know it was 47 because I counted. Not deliberately. I simply became aware at some point that I had read it again, and started keeping track because tracking. Something gave me something to do with my hands and my mind while the rest of me sat completely still on my sofa in Didsbury, with the tomato plants visible through the balcony door, and the ordinary sounds of a Thursday evening coming through the walls of the flat, and everything around me continuing as if nothing had happened while everything inside me was happening all at once. "I think you might be my mother. I was told you were dead." 14 words. I had waited 15 years, and the thing that ended the waiting was 14 words from an account with a profile photograph of a young man I had never met who had my eyes. He had my eyes. That was the first thing I saw, and the thing I kept coming back to between readings. Green and slightly too serious for casual conversation. Looking out of a profile photograph on a genealogy website at 11:17 on a Thursday evening. 20 years old and asking a question that must have cost him something to type, that must have sat in his drafts, or in his head, or in the space between what he had found and what he could bring himself to send for some amount of time before he pressed whatever button sent it to me. "I think you might be my mother." Not "you are my mother." Not "I know who you are." A tentative thing. A careful thing. The message of someone who has discovered something enormous and is holding it lightly because they do not yet know if it will hold their weight. I was told you were dead. 5 words that contained 15 years. I wrote 17 replies before I sent one. The first was too long. The second was too emotional. The third was factually accurate but cold in a way that felt wrong for what this was. The fourth started with "I have been looking for you," which was not quite true in the literal sense. And I did not want to begin with something that required immediate qualification. The fifth was too short. The sixth made me cry while I was writing it, which meant it was probably right emotionally, and almost certainly wrong strategically, because this was not the moment for my emotions. This was the moment for his. The reply I sent at 12:43 in the morning, after nearly 90 minutes of trying, was this. My name is Ruth Callahan. I am 22 years older than you, which means if your birthday is the 14th of October, then yes. I think I might be your mother too. I have a photograph of you from the day before I lost you. You were 6 months old and asleep in a pale yellow blanket. I have kept it for 15 years. I am so sorry it took this long for us to find each other. I am so sorry for what you were told. Take whatever time you need. I will be here. I sent it. I put my phone face down on the sofa cushion. I picked it up again immediately and checked that it had sent. It had sent. I put it face down again. I did not sleep that night. I lay in bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about a 20-year-old in Leeds making very good coffee and sitting with a message from a stranger who was not a stranger and deciding what to do with it. I thought about what it meant to be told at 20 that the foundational fact of your childhood, the loss you had organized your understanding of yourself around, was not true. I thought about what that does to a person, what it requires of them, what it asks. I thought about whether he would reply. He replied at 7:24 the next morning. The message said, I have been up all night. I think I need to talk to you. Can we call? I called him at 7:25. He answered on the first ring. And for the first time in 15 years I heard my son's voice. His voice was lower than I had imagined. I do not know why I had imagined it differently. He was 20 years old. Of course his voice was low. But somewhere in the 15 years of thinking about him, I had kept him younger than he was. Not frozen exactly. Not the 6-month-old in the yellow blanket, but younger than 20. Younger than the person who answered the phone at 7:25 on a Friday morning and said hello in a voice that was steady and careful and slightly rough in the way voices are when someone has not slept. Hello, I said. A pause. Ruth, he said. Not Mum, Ruth, which was right. Which was the only thing it could be at that point, and which I had prepared myself for, and which still landed differently than I had prepared for. Yes, I said. Hi. Another pause. Longer this time. The pause of 2 people on either end of a phone call that contains 15 years, and neither of them quite knowing which end to pick up first. He picked it up. I need to ask you something, he said. And I need you to answer me honestly, even if you think the answer is going to be hard to hear. Can you do that? Yes, I said. Why did you give me up? I had expected this question. I had thought about it for 15 years in various forms and had prepared for it, the way you prepare for something you know is coming but cannot fully brace for because the actual experience of it is always different from the rehearsal. I did not give you up, I said. I want to start there because everything else depends on you understanding that first. I did not choose to lose you. I was 22 years old and I was alone. And I was fighting something I did not have the resources to fight, and I lost. Not because I stopped. Not because I gave up. Because the people on the other side had more than I did. And they used all of it. The line was quiet. I kept going. I told him everything. Not the condensed version. Not the version edited for palatability, or shaped to make me sound better than I was, or to make the Voss family sound worse than the facts already made them. The full version. The pressure before he was born. The anonymous referral to social services. The residency order. The adoption hearing. Patricia Cole reading me the judgment over the phone above the sandwich shop. The 15 years of keeping his photograph on my bookshelf. The genealogy website. The Sunday afternoon in September when I uploaded the photograph, because my friend Rachel had spent 3 years telling me I had nothing to lose. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough that I checked once that the call was still connected. It was. Then he said, "They told me you died in a car accident when I was 6 months old. They said it was sudden, and that you loved me, and that there was nothing anyone could have done." "I know," I said. "I asked about you," he said, "when I was older, 7 or 8. I asked my grandmother, meaning Margaret, for more details. She told me there were no photographs because the accident had been very sudden, and there had not been time. She told me your family had not stayed in touch after you died. She told me it was painful to talk about, and she would prefer if we did not." "Of course she did," I said. And then I stopped because that was not useful. "I had a photograph of myself," he said. "One photograph. In an album my grandmother kept. She told me it was taken when I was a baby. I used to look at it sometimes. I think I was trying to see you in my own face." My throat closed. "Did you?" I said when I could. "See anything?" A pause. "Your eyes," he said quietly. "I always thought my eyes looked different from everyone else in the family. I could not figure out where they came from." "They came from me," I said. "Yeah," he said. "I know that now." We talked for 3 hours that morning. By the end of it my tea had gone cold twice, and the tomato plants on the balcony were catching the early morning light, and somewhere in Leeds my son was sitting with everything I had told him, and I was sitting with everything he had told me. And neither of us had any idea yet what came next. But both of us were still on the line. That felt like enough for that morning. That felt like the beginning of something. We talked every day for the first 2 weeks. Not always for 3 hours. Sometimes 20 minutes, sometimes more, depending on his lectures and my work, and the particular shape of each day. But every day. He sent me voice messages when he could not call, which I had not known about yet. The voice message habit. And when he told me about it, he said what he always said, that texts lose the tone of things and tone matters. I saved every one of them to a folder on my phone labeled simply N, which was not subtle but was honest. He was careful with me in those first 2 weeks. Not cold. The way you are careful with something you are not yet sure how to hold. He asked questions and listened to the answers and did not rush toward conclusions or emotions that had not yet been earned by the actual time spent. He was, I realized gradually, much more measured than I had expected a 20-year-old to be. More measured than I had been at 20. More measured, frankly, than I was at 37. Sitting on my sofa every evening talking to my son for the first time and trying not to let the accumulated weight of 15 years pour out of me all at once in a way that would overwhelm him before he had found his footing. I asked him about his life carefully and in pieces. He told me about Leeds, about civil engineering, which he had chosen because he liked the idea of building things that were useful and would last. About his flatmates, 2 of them, a quiet one named Marcus and a loud one named Dan, who had strong opinions about football and very little else. About the coffee, which had started with a broken student coffee machine and a YouTube tutorial and had become, in his words, a mild obsession that his flatmates found both useful and alarming. About how things should be done and who should do them and what mattered. I think he believed that what he did for me was right. I think he believed it completely. Margaret was still alive. Still in Harrogate. Still, by Noah's account, formidable in the way she had always been, though quieter now, the particular quiet of a woman who has lost the person she organized her life around, and is in the process of understanding what remains. Noah had been told growing up that his mother, meaning me, had loved him. That had been consistent. They had not made me a villain. They had made me a ghost, which was in some ways more complete. A villain can be argued with. A ghost is simply gone. He had not questioned the story until he was 17. That was when the questions had started, quietly and without direction. The way questions start when you have been given an answer that almost fits, but not quite. Not about me or about the adoption, or about any of the complicated legal architecture that had built the situation. About the lie itself. The car accident. The no photographs. The it is too painful to discuss. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think I'm still figuring that out. I know how I feel about finding you. That part is clear. The other part is something I'm going to need more time with." "That is fair," I said. "I know," he said. "I just wanted you to know that the anger is there. It is just not at you." I understood that. I held it carefully. That was enough for that conversation. That was more than enough, that we met for the first time on a Saturday in December. Noah suggested Leeds because it was his city, and he felt more grounded there, which I understood completely, and agreed to without hesitation. We chose a coffee shop near his university, a small independent place called Foundry, on a side street off the main road, which he had selected because he knew the coffee was good, and because he wanted at least one element of the meeting to be something he was certain about. I drove up from Manchester on Saturday morning. 2 hours on the motorway with the radio off because I could not concentrate on music or speech, and needed the quiet. I arrived 40 minutes early and sat in my car on a side street 2 roads from Foundry and looked at my own, hands on the steering wheel, and breathed. I had thought about what to wear for 3 days. Not because I am a person who thinks about clothes for 3 days under normal circumstances, but because this was not normal circumstances and the clothes felt important in a way I could not entirely articulate. I wanted to look like myself, not a dressed-up version of myself, not the version that was trying too hard or communicating something through appearance that should be communicated through being present. Just myself. I settled on dark trousers and a green jumper that Rachel said made my eyes look exactly what they were. I walked into Foundry at 11:05. He was already there. He was sitting at a table by the window, both hands around a coffee cup, looking at the door. And when I walked in and our eyes met across the small room, I understood, in the particular way you understand things that bypass language entirely, that I would have known him anywhere. Not because he looked like my photograph of him. He did not, particularly, except for the eyes. 20 years changes a person in ways that a photograph cannot contain. That there was something else. Something that had nothing to do with appearance and everything to do with recognition. The specific, cellular, unargued knowledge of a person you are connected to in a way that does not require time to establish, because it was established before either of you had a choice about it. He stood up when I reached the table. We looked at each other for a moment. Then he said, "Your jumper is green." "I know," I said. "Your eyes are the same color," he said. "I know that too," I said. He looked at me for another moment, and then he did something I had not planned for, and had not prepared for, and which undid 15 years of careful management in approximately 4 seconds. He hugged me. Not a tentative hug, not the careful, boundaried embrace of 2 people who are not sure yet what they are to each other. A real one. The kind that comes from somewhere below decision, below politeness, below all the careful, measured conversations of the previous 2 weeks. The kind that says something the voice cannot quite say yet, because the words have not caught up with what the body already knows. I held on. I am not going to pretend I did not cry. I cried immediately, and without any of the composure I had promised myself I would maintain. He did not cry, not then, though his jaw was tight in the way that jaw tightens when something is being held with significant effort. He held on, and I held on, and the coffee shop continued around us, and nobody paid any particular attention because people hug in coffee shops and nobody knows what any given hug contains. That one contained 15 years. We sat down eventually. He got me a coffee. He had remembered from one of our conversations that I took it with oat milk and no sugar, which was a small thing and an enormous thing simultaneously. We sat across from each other at the table by the window, and we looked at each other in the particular way of two people who are seeing something they have only previously been able to imagine. He was real. He was right there. He was drinking coffee and looking at me with my own eyes, and he was real. That was the only thought I had for the first few minutes. He is real, and he is right here, and I found him. We stayed in Foundry for 4 hours. The coffee shop filled up and emptied out around us, and we ordered 2 more rounds, and at some point someone asked if we wanted to see the lunch menu, and we said yes without really intending to, and ended up eating soup and bread without either of us particularly noticing because the eating was incidental to everything else that was happening at that table. We talked about his life first. I had asked for that in advance, in one of our evening calls, because I wanted to hear about it in person, with his face in front of me, so I could see the expressions that accompanied the words and understand the texture of the life he was describing more completely than a phone call allowed. He talked about school, about being a good student, methodical and thorough, the kind of student who did not find things effortless, but who worked with a consistency that produced results. About his first year at Leeds, the adjustment of it, the particular loneliness of the first few months before the friendships formed that made a place feel inhabited rather than visited. About civil engineering and why it suited him, the combination of precision and purpose, the satisfaction of understanding how things held together and why, the appeal of building something that would be there after you were gone. He talked about Margaret, not with bitterness. That surprised me until I thought about it, and then it did not surprise me at all. Noah had grown up with Margaret as his primary caregiver. She had fed him and clothed him and attended his school events and sat with him when he was ill, and done the 10,000 ordinary things that constitute a childhood being maintained. The lie she had told was enormous. What she had done to me was enormous. But she had also, in the space created by that lie, genuinely raised him. Those two things existed simultaneously, and Noah was honest enough to hold both of them without flattening either one. She loves me, he said. I do not doubt that. I am also furious with her. Those two things are both true, and I do not know yet what to do with them existing at the same time. I told him I understood that. He looked at me. Do you, he said. Because she took you from me. And whatever else she did, that is the part I keep coming back to. You were alive. You were always alive. And she knew that, and she looked me in the face for 20 years. And she let me believe you were not. I nodded. How does that sit with you? He asked. That I still have a relationship with her. I had thought about this. I have thought about it carefully in the way I thought about everything that involved Noah, with the understanding that my feelings about it were mine to manage, and his decisions about it were his to make. She is the grandmother who raised you, I said. I am not going to tell you what to do with that relationship. It is not mine to direct. What I will tell you is that what she did was wrong, and she needs to be accountable for it. Not to me necessarily. To you. You deserve an honest conversation with her about what she did and why. And you deserve to make your own decisions about what comes after that conversation. He was quiet for a moment. I have been thinking about that conversation, he said. I have not had it yet. I have not known how to start it. You start it the way you started this, I said. You find the right moment, and you say the thing that needs to be said, even though you do not know yet how it will land. You were brave enough to send me a message at 11:17 on a Thursday evening, after finding a photograph on a genealogy website. You can be brave enough for that conversation. He looked at his coffee cup. Will you help me, he said. Not in the room, not part of the conversation, but afterward. Will you be there afterward? I looked at him across the table. I have been there for 15 years, I said. I am not going anywhere now. He nodded slowly. Something settled in his face. The particular settling of a person who has been carrying something alone and has just understood that they do not have to anymore. Outside the window, the December street was grey and cold, and people were moving past with their coats pulled tight and their breath visible in the air. Inside Foundry, it was warm and smelled of coffee, and something was being built at a table by the window. That had been interrupted 20 years ago and was only now, carefully and imperfectly, and with full knowledge of everything it had cost, being resumed. Noah had the conversation with Margaret in January. He told me about it afterward on a Sunday evening, in a voice message that lasted 22 minutes and that I listened to 3 times before I replied. He had driven to Harrogate on a Saturday, which was the first time he had been back since the Christmas visit he had cut short by 2 days, telling Margaret he needed to get back to Leeds for coursework, which was not entirely untrue, but was not the whole truth either. He had arrived at the house on Duchy Road, the large Victorian house with the bay windows and the immaculate garden that I had been inside exactly once, 20 years ago, when Patricia Cole had arranged a supervised contact visit that had lasted 2 hours, and had been the last time I had seen my son before the genealogy website found us. Margaret had made tea. Of course she had. Margaret's response to any situation that required navigation was to make tea and sit down at the kitchen table and approach things with the careful, composed formality that had been her register for as long as Noah had known her. He had let her make the tea. He had sat down. And then he had told her what he had found. He said her face had done something he had not seen it do before. Not the composed formality. Not the carefully managed warmth she deployed for significant occasions. Something underneath all of that. Something older and less controlled. He described it as the face of a person who has been waiting for a particular knock on the door for 20 years and has just heard it. She had not denied it. That was the first thing he told me, the thing I came back to most in the 3 times I listened to the message. She had not denied it. There had been no version of events offered, no reframing, no carefully constructed alternative explanation. She had sat with her tea in both hands, and she had looked at her grandson, and she had said, I wondered when this would come. Not if. When. She had known for 20 years that this conversation existed somewhere in the future. She had simply not known when it would arrive. Noah had asked her why. She had taken a long time to answer. He described the silence as one of the longest he had ever sat in, which from a person of Noah's measured patience was significant. Then she had said, I believed it was the kindest thing. For you. A clean beginning without the complication of a connection to a life we had decided was not the right life for you. I believed that a child who knew his mother was alive, but absent would suffer more than a child who understood his mother to be gone. I told myself it was mercy. Noah had asked her if she still believed that. She had been quiet again. Then she had said no. I stopped believing it when you were about 8 years old, and you asked me for more details about your mother, and I looked at your face and I understood for the first time what it costs a child to grow up with a loss that cannot be questioned, because the person is gone. You could not be angry at a dead woman. You could not wonder why she had not tried. You could only grieve. And I watched you grieve something I had manufactured, and I told myself it was still the right decision, because by then there was no clean way back. Noah had not said anything for a while after that. Then he had said, You took something from me that I cannot get back. 20 years of knowing her. 20 years of her knowing me. I needed you to understand that I understand what that means and that I am not going to pretend it is something smaller than it is. Margaret had nodded. He had not forgiven her. He had not told her that everything was all right, or that he understood or that love excused what had been done. He had sat with her for another hour, and they had talked about other things, carefully and quietly, and then he had driven back to Leeds and called me and talked for 22 minutes. At the end of the voice message he said, "I do not know what happens with her now. I need time." I told him I was glad he existed. He replied 3 minutes later. He said, "Me too." The months that followed were not a straight line. I want to be honest about that because I think stories like this one invite a particular kind of ending, the clean reunion, the restored relationship, the years of loss dissolved by the fact of finding each other. And I do not want to give you that ending, because it would not be true, and because Noah deserves better than a tidy version of what actually happened. What actually happened was more complicated and more real, and in its own way more valuable than the clean version would have been. We built something, carefully and incrementally, and with full awareness on both sides that we were building it from a foundation that had a 20-year gap in the middle, and that the gap did not disappear simply because we had found each other. It remained. We worked around it. We worked through it. Sometimes we worked directly in it, those conversations where the missing time sat between us on the table, like something that needed to be acknowledged before we could get to anything else. He came to Manchester in February. I showed him the flat. The balcony with the tomato plants, dormant in their pots in the February cold, which he found both amusing and impressive when I told him about the aggressive dedication Rachel had described. He looked at the bookshelf and found his photograph, the 6-month-old in the pale yellow blanket, in its frame in the spot it had occupied for 15 years. He stood in front of it for a long time. Then he said, "You kept it here, not in a drawer. Here." "Yes," I said. He nodded slowly. He did not say anything else about it. He did not need to. Some things communicate themselves completely, without requiring elaboration. We went for a walk along the canal. It was cold and grey, and February in Manchester is not the city at its most compelling, but he did not seem to mind. He asked me about my work, and I told him about the paralegal practice and the cases I found most interesting, and the ones that were genuinely difficult, and the particular satisfaction of helping someone navigate a system that had not been built with them in mind. He listened with the focused attention he brought to everything, and asked questions that were genuinely curious rather than politely obligatory. He told me more about his course, about a project he was working on that involved bridge design, the engineering principles of load and tension, and the way structures distribute stress across their components so that no single point carries more than it can bear. He described it with the quiet enthusiasm of someone who has found the thing that genuinely interests them and is still slightly surprised by how much. I thought about load and tension and the distribution of stress. I thought it was an interesting thing for my son to be studying. Rachel met him in March. She had been my closest friend for 11 years and had been present for the worst and the best of the 15 years between losing Noah and finding him. And I had wanted her to meet him and had been slightly terrified of it simultaneously, in the way you are terrified of two important things meeting, in case the meeting changes one of them. It did not change anything. Rachel sat across from Noah at my kitchen table and talked to him the way she talked to everyone, directly and with genuine interest, and without the particular performance some people put on when they are trying to make a good impression on someone else's child. Noah responded to her immediately because Noah, I was learning, responded to directness the way some people respond to warmth, as the register that made him feel most comfortable. Afterward, Rachel pulled me into the kitchen while Noah was looking at the bookshelf again, and she said, "Ruth, He is extraordinary, you know that? And I said, I know. And she said, no, I mean it. Not because he is yours. Because of who he actually is. And I said, I know. And she said, no, I mean it. Not because he is yours. Because of who he actually is. And I stood in my kitchen with my best friend, and I thought about a 20-year-old who made very good coffee and sent voice messages because texts lose the tone of things, and studied the way structures distribute stress. So no single point carries more than it can bear. I thought he was extraordinary too. Not because he was mine. Because of who he actually was. That was the loss that sat heaviest. Not the years themselves. The becoming. The 20 years of ordinary days that made him Noah. And that I had not been there for. I sat with that for a long time. Then I picked up my phone and sent him a voice message. I told him I had been thinking about bridge design. About load and tension. About the way structures distribute stress across their components, so no single point carries more than it can bear. I told him I thought he was built that way. He replied 12 minutes later. He said, I think I learned it from you. Even without knowing it. Some things pass without contact. I sat with that sentence for even longer than the one before it. Some things pass without contact. I did not know if that was true in any scientific sense. I did not know if it was provable or demonstrable or anything other than a thing a 20-year-old had said to his mother on a Tuesday evening, because it felt right. But it felt right to me too. And sometimes that is enough. Noah is 20 years old and studying civil engineering in Leeds, and makes very good coffee and sends voice messages because texts lose the tone of things. That is who he is right now. That is the current version of a person who will keep becoming other versions, older and more complicated, and shaped by experiences neither of us can predict, for the rest of his life. I know that. I hold it carefully. The understanding that finding him was not the end of something but the beginning, and that beginnings are not guarantees, they are simply openings. Doors that have been unlocked and are now available to walk through if both people are willing. We are both willing. That is not nothing. After everything, that is not a small thing. I want to tell you what happened with the Voss family. Not because it is the most important part of this story. It is not. The most important part of this story is a young man in Leeds drinking good coffee and studying bridges and existing in the world as a person, found after 15 years of keeping his photograph on my bookshelf. That is the part that matters most. But you deserve to know the rest. Elliot contacted me in February, 6 weeks after Noah told Margaret what he had found. A short email, formal and carefully worded. The kind of email that has been reviewed by a solicitor before sending. It expressed regret for the decisions made, and acknowledged that I had been treated unjustly. It did not ask for anything. It did not offer anything beyond the expression of regret itself. It was the minimum possible communication, and it was years too late, and I read it twice and then I closed it and I have not replied. Not out of bitterness. Out of clarity. Elliot made his choices 20 years ago, and the regret he expressed in a carefully worded email does not require anything from me. Patricia Cole, the solicitor who worked above the sandwich shop on James Street, and told me it would cost everything I had, and possibly still losing, retired 3 years ago. I found this out while looking for her, wanting to tell her what had happened. I wrote her a letter through the firm that had taken over her practice and asked them to forward it. I do not know if she received it. I hope she did. She deserved to know that the woman she had helped, imperfectly and with insufficient resources against an opponent who had too many, had found her son 20 years later on a genealogy website at 11:17 on a Thursday evening. I grew tomatoes again last summer. Better than the previous year, which Rachel said was not possible given what she described as the previous year's frankly unreasonable yield. But it was possible, and I proved it. Noah came to stay for a weekend in August, and I made him eat tomatoes with every meal for 2 days, which he endured with good humor, an only moderate complaint. He helped me report 2 of the plants on the Sunday afternoon. We stood on the small balcony in the August sun with our hands in the compost. And he told me about a project he was starting in his 3rd year. And I told him about a case at work that had reminded me of something Patricia Cole had said to me 20 years ago. And we talked for 2 hours without either of us noticing the time passing. That is what I want to tell you about. Not the legal hearings or the anonymous referral or the adoption order or the lie told to a child young enough that by the time he was old enough to question it, the lie had become the shape of his world. All of that is true, and all of it matters, and none of it is the most important thing. The most important thing is 2 people standing on a small balcony in Manchester, with their hands in the compost on a Sunday afternoon in August, talking about things that matter to them while the tomatoes grow around them, and the city goes about its ordinary business below. He has my eyes. He sends voice messages because texts lose the tone of things. He is building things that will last. And every morning when I walk past the bookshelf, I see the photograph of a 6-month-old in a pale yellow blanket, and beside it now, in a frame I added in September, a photograph of a 20-year-old with green eyes slightly too serious for casual conversation, standing on a balcony in Manchester holding a tomato like it is evidence of something. It is evidence of something. It is evidence that some things cannot be buried permanently. That some things find their way back regardless of what is built on top of them. That 15 years is a long time, and also, when measured against everything it gave back, not long enough to matter as much as they wanted it to. He found me. I was always here. And now, finally, after everything, so was he.